24 hours after the explosion, the battle for Accord Prime began. Veth-Torak's forces breached the station through an emergency airlock on the eastern side. 40 extremist warriors poured through the breach, expecting to find frozen aliens and scattered humans. Instead, they found a unified defense force that had been preparing for hours. The first wave of attackers fell quickly. Tyrellian warriors, who had broken the stillness, fought with a fury that surprised everyone, including themselves. They channeled their grief into action, turning mourning into a weapon. Commander Veth-Kara led them personally, his massive blade cutting through extremists like paper. Daniel fought alongside them, using a weapon that Kethnora had given him. It was a Tyrellian sidearm, lighter than human designs, but more powerful. He was not a soldier. He was a diplomat. But diplomacy had ended when the bomb exploded, and now he would do what was necessary. The fighting spread through the damaged corridors of the station. Extremists pushed forward, while the defenders held their ground. Bodies fell on both sides. The sound of weapons fire echoed through metal hallways that had never known violence. Lisa Parks stayed in the medical wing, treating the wounded from both sides of the battle. When an extremist was brought in with severe injuries, she treated him with the same care she gave everyone else. Kethnora asked her why she would help an enemy. Lisa said that he was no longer a combatant. He was a patient, and patients receive care. Kethnora did not understand, but she helped anyway. The battle reached the central hub, where Veth-Torak himself led the final assault. The extremist leader was enormous, even by Tyrellian standards, his scarred body telling the story of a lifetime of warfare. He cut through defenders with terrible efficiency, pushing toward the main control room. Daniel met him there. It should have been absurd. A human diplomatic attach facing a Tyrellian war hero. Daniel was smaller, weaker, slower. He had no chance in single combat, but he was not alone. Elder Veth Prime stood beside him, her ancient body frail but her will unbroken. Commander Veth-Kara flanked him on the other side, his blade ready. Kethnora covered them with a weapon she should not have known how to use. Maria Santos guarded the engineering controls, ensuring that the station systems remained stable. A dozen other beings, human and alien, formed a line that would not break. Veth-Torak stopped at the sight of them. His eyes moved across the assembled defenders, counting species that should have been enemies. His expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something darker. He spoke in a voice that filled the room. He demanded to know how this was possible. These species had hated each other for generations. They had fought wars over resources and territory. They had nothing in common except a shared space station. Daniel stepped forward and answered him. He said that they had found something in common. They had found it in the 18 hours since the explosion. They had discovered that when tragedy strikes, some beings stop and some beings move. The ones who move find each other. They form bonds that transcend species and history. They create something new. He told Veth-Torak that the bomb had not destroyed the peace process. It had accelerated it. In trying to freeze the galaxy in grief, the extremists had revealed what humans knew all along. Stopping was a choice. Moving forward was also a choice. And given the option, most beings would eventually choose to move. Veth-Torak's face twisted with rage. He charged forward, blade raised, determined to cut down the human who had ruined everything. Commander Veth-Kara met him halfway. The two Tyrellians clashed in a fury of scales and steel. They were evenly matched, two warriors from the same culture who had chosen different paths. The fight lasted only moments, but it felt eternal. In the end, Veth-Kara stood over Veth-Torak's fallen body. The extremist leader was not dead, merely defeated. Veth-Kara looked down at him with something that might have been pity. He said that Veth-Torak had been a great warrior once, but he had forgotten what warriors were supposed to protect. He had become so focused on fighting that he forgot why fighting mattered. The remaining extremists surrendered quickly after their leader fell. The battle was over. Accord Prime had survived Dot in the hours that followed. Ambassador Yurasan finally woke from her injuries. She found a station transformed from what she remembered. Humans and aliens worked together to repair damage and treat wounded. Species that had been on the edge of war now coordinated security patrols. The stillness had ended, and something new had taken its place. She asked Daniel to explain what had happened. He tried, but the words felt inadequate. How could he describe 18 hours of constant motion, of small acts of courage, of traditions breaking and new bonds forming? How could he explain what it felt like to hold a dying child's hand while the galaxy stood frozen around him? The ambassador listened carefully. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she smiled and said that this was the most important diplomatic achievement in human history. Not because humans had forced their ways on other species, but because they had shown another path. They had demonstrated that there was more than one way to grieve, more than one way to honor the dead. The peace treaty was signed 3 days later. It was different from the original proposal. The species who had fought together on Accord Prime insisted on adding new provisions for mutual defense and cooperation. What had been a simple trade agreement became something larger, a foundation for a true galactic community. Daniel was asked to speak at the signing ceremony. He stood before representatives of 12 species and tried to find the right words. He told them that humans were not special. They were not stronger or smarter or braver than anyone else in the room. They had simply learned something a long time ago. They learned that grief was not stillness. Grief was action. It was standing up when everything in you wanted to stop. It was holding a stranger's hand while they died, and then standing up and saving the next one. He looked around the room at faces both familiar and strange. He saw Commander Vethkara, who had buried his nephew with full honors. He saw Elder Veth Prime, who had lost 3 children but gained new hope. He saw Kethnora, who had broken tradition and found a new purpose. He saw Lisa, Maria, and Kevin, and all the humans who had refused to stop. He said that humanity did not stop after the strike. They got back up. And now, looking at this room full of species who had stood with them, he understood something new. This was not just a human trait anymore. This was what the galaxy could become when tragedy brought beings together, instead of driving them apart. The room was silent when he finished. Then, Elder Veth Prime rose from her seat. Her ancient body trembled with the effort, but she stood tall. She began to click in her native language, and the translator rendered her words for everyone to hear. She said that she had lived for 300 years. She had seen wars and treaties, disasters and triumphs, but she had never seen anything like the past 3 days. She had watched a young species teach the galaxy something it had forgotten. She had learned that honoring the dead meant protecting the living. She thanked Daniel. She thanked all the humans. And then she said something that would be repeated across the galaxy for generations to come. She said that when the next tragedy struck, the galaxy would not stop. The galaxy would move forward. Together, the ceremony ended with applause from a dozen different species. Daniel stood among them, exhausted and overwhelmed, and more hopeful than he had ever been. The bomb had been meant to destroy everything. Instead, it had created something new. A galaxy that had learned to keep moving. A future built by beings who refused to stop. And at the center of it all, one human who had simply done what humans always did. He had looked at tragedy and chosen to move forward. He had held a stranger's hand in the darkness. He had refused to be still. That was enough. That was everything. Mava's everything. 18 hours after the explosion, the first aliens began to truly move Dot. It started in the medical wing, where Lisa Park had saved 93 lives. A Garth physician who had stood frozen for hours suddenly stepped forward and took over treatment of one of his own people. He said nothing. He offered no explanation. He simply began working, his stone-like hands surprisingly gentle as they treated wounds. Others followed. 2 Sendari nurses moved to assist Lisa with a difficult procedure. A Veth elder activated a healing chamber and began treating the wounded children of his collective. The stillness was ending, not with an announcement, but with quiet acts of defiance against tradition. Nora watched it happen with tears on her scaled face. She had been the first Tyrellian to move. She had carried the shame of that choice for hours. Now she saw that she had not broken tradition. She had started something new. Daniel Cole stood in the central hub, watching the enemy vessel on the sensor screens. It had stopped at the edge of weapon range, waiting. Perhaps the extremists had expected to find a defenseless station. The activated shields must have surprised them, but shields would not last forever. The station was damaged, running on emergency power. Eventually, the defenses would fail, and the extremists would attack. Commander Vethkara appeared at Daniel's side. The massive Tyrellian warrior had finally broken his stillness. His eyes were red with grief, but his posture was strong. He studied the sensor readings and spoke in a low, rumbling voice. He told Daniel that the extremist leader was named Vethtorik. The man was a war hero who had become convinced that peace with the Veth collective was impossible. He had planted the bomb to destroy the negotiations. The stillness that followed had been part of his plan. He knew that galactic tradition would freeze everyone in place, leaving the station vulnerable. Daniel asked why Vethkara had broken the stillness. The commander was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He said that he had watched Daniel hold his dying nephew's hand. The young warrior who had died in the corridor had been Vethkara's sister's child. When the boy lay dying, Vethkara had wanted to go to him more than he had ever wanted anything. But tradition held him in place. He could not move to comfort his own family. And then Daniel had appeared. A strange being from a strange species had knelt beside the boy and held his hand until the end. A human had done what Vethkara could not. The commander's voice broke slightly. He said that watching Daniel had taught him something about grief. The stillness was meant to honor the dead, but abandoning the dying did not honor anyone. Daniel did not know what to say. He simply nodded and turned back to the sensor screens. More aliens were arriving in the central hub now. Tyrellian warriors who had broken their stillness. Veth collective soldiers who had chosen action over tradition. Even a few Sendari and Gorath had come, their usual grace and stoicism replaced by something more urgent. Elder Veth Prime was among them. The ancient insectoid moved slowly, supported by 2 younger members of the collective. 3 of her offspring had died in the explosion. Daniel could not imagine her pain. The elder approached Daniel and stopped before him. Her translator clicked and hummed as it processed her chemical speech. She asked a simple question. She asked why humans did not stop. Daniel considered his answer carefully. He told her that humans came from a harsh world where stopping meant death. Their history was filled with disasters, with plagues and wars and catastrophes that should have ended them. But they never stopped. When tragedy struck, they buried their dead and then turned to face the future. Grief was real, but grief did not require paralysis. The elder listened. Her compound eyes reflected the light from the sensor screens. When Daniel finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke. She said that her species had practiced the stillness for thousands of years. It was sacred. It was right. But watching humans work had made her question everything she knew. She had lost 3 children. The pain was unimaginable. But during the stillness, she had watched a young human woman fight to save Veth lives. Lisa Park had worked until her hands bled, treating aliens she had never met. refusing to stop even when her body begged for rest. That human woman had saved one of the elder's remaining grandchildren. If Lisa had observed the stillness, the child would have died. The elder's translator clicked one final time. She said that perhaps the dead were not honored by stillness. Perhaps they were honored by protecting the living. She turned to face the other aliens in the room. She spoke in her native language, her chemical signals filling the air. Daniel did not need a translator to understand. She was telling her people to move. She was giving them permission to break tradition. One by one, the aliens in the central hub began to stir. Warriors checked their weapons. Technicians moved to repair stations. Officers studied tactical displays and began planning for the coming attack. The stillness was ending. Captain Kevin Grant contacted Daniel from the Steadfast. His voice held a mix of relief and warning. The enemy vessel was beginning to move again. Vethtorak had apparently decided that waiting was pointless. He was coming to finish what he had started. Daniel looked around the central hub. Humans and aliens stood together now, preparing to defend the station. Kath Nora had arrived from the medical wing, a weapon in her clawed hands. Commander Vethkara was organizing his warriors into defensive positions. Elder Veth Prime was coordinating the Veth collective soldiers that it was not the alliance anyone had expected. 12 hours ago, these species had barely been able to sit in the same room without fighting. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, united by a crisis and inspired by a species they had considered primitive. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. It might have been hope. The enemy vessel closed to weapon range. Vethtorak broadcast a message to the station. His voice was cold and certain. He declared that the peace process was dead. He promised to destroy everyone who had participated in the negotiations. He said that the galaxy would thank him for preventing a dishonorable peace. Daniel stepped forward and activated the station's communication system. He responded to Vethtorak in a calm voice. He said that the peace process was not dead. He said that the attack had not destroyed the alliance. Instead, it had created something new. Humans and Terrellians and Veth and a dozen other species were standing together right now, preparing to defend the station. He told Vethtorak that the extremists had made a mistake. They had assumed the tragedy would freeze everyone in place. They had not counted on humans. And they had not counted on what humans could teach other species about moving forward. The communication channel went silent. On the sensor screens, the enemy vessel paused its approach. Then Vethtorak laughed. The sound was ugly, filled with contempt. He said that a few traitors and one small group of humans could not stop his forces. He ordered his ship forward. Daniel looked at the beings around him. Aliens who had been enemies were now allies. Species who had never fought together were preparing to stand side by side. It was not much of an army, but it was something. He drew a deep breath and prepared for what was coming. The enemy was approaching. The battle was about to begin, and humanity would not stop. 12 hours after the explosion, Accord Prime was still standing. This was a miracle that belonged entirely to 37 humans who refused to let it fall. Maria Santos worked in the engineering section, surrounded by frozen Terrellian technicians who watched her with unblinking eyes. She was 26 years old, barely 3 years out of the academy, and she was single-handedly keeping the station's life support systems running. Her hands were burned from touching conduits that should have been too hot to handle. Her voice was hoarse from talking to herself, explaining every step of her repairs to aliens who would not respond. She found the talking helpful. It made the silence feel less crushing. And she had noticed that the frozen Terrellians seemed to lean slightly toward her when she spoke, as if they were trying to hear every word. The main power coupling had failed an hour ago. Without it, life support would shut down across 5 sections of the station. Hundreds would suffocate. Maria had studied human engineering at the academy, not alien systems. But engineering principles were universal, and she was very good at her job. She traced the power flow through unfamiliar conduits, following the logic of alien design. The Tyrellians built things differently than humans, but the underlying physics was the same. Energy had to flow somewhere. Systems had to connect. Problems had solutions. She found the damaged coupling and studied it carefully. The repair would require tools. She did not have a knowledge that existed only in the minds of the frozen technicians around her. She started talking again, describing the problem aloud, working through possible solutions. A soft sound interrupted her. One of the Tyrellian technicians had shifted slightly. His rigid posture had loosened just a fraction. His eyes were focused on the damaged coupling, and his claws twitched as if he wanted to reach for it. Maria kept talking. She described what she thought needed to happen. She asked questions that no one answered. She made guesses and admitted when she was wrong. The Tyrellian moved. It was small, just a single step forward, but it was movement. He pointed at a tool on the wall, a curved instrument that Maria had not recognized. She grabbed it and held it up. The Tyrellian nodded once, then froze again, as if the effort had exhausted him. It was enough. Maria used the tool and found that it fit perfectly into the damaged coupling. She worked quickly, making repairs that should have taken a team of engineers hours to complete. When she was finished, the power coupling hummed back to life. 5 sections of the station would keep breathing. She thanked the Tyrellian, even though he did not respond. She thought she saw something in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps. Or maybe just pain. Across the station, similar scenes were playing out. Human volunteers worked while aliens watched. Sometimes, a frozen figure would make a small gesture, pointing at a tool or nodding toward a solution. These tiny acts of help came at great personal cost. Each one was a violation of sacred tradition. A crack in the wall of the stillness. Captain Kevin Grant monitored everything from the steadfast bridge. He had served in the human fleet for 30 years, and he had never seen anything like this. His crew was scattered across a dying station, surrounded by beings who would not move, fighting to save lives that the galaxy seemed willing to abandon. The diplomatic situation was deteriorating. 12 species had now filed formal protests against humanity's actions. The Sindari delegation had threatened to withdraw from all future negotiations. The Veth Collective, despite losing their high speaker, had called human behavior an insult to the dead. Kevin ignored all of it. He had 43 wounded aliens in the station's medical wing who would have died without human intervention. He had prevented 3 separate system failures that would have killed hundreds. Let them file their protests. History would judge who was right. In the medical wing, Lisa Park had not stopped working for 12 hours. Her hands shook from exhaustion. Her vision blurred at the edges. But there were still wounded who needed treatment, and she could not stop. Keth Nora worked beside her, the young Tyrellian officer who had broken tradition to help. Others had joined them now. 3 more Tyrellians had stepped forward in the past hour, unable to watch any longer. A young Veth technician had activated a healing chamber to save one of her own people. A Sindari physician had silently begun treating wounds, his graceful hands moving while his face remained expressionless. The stillness was cracking. Small fractures were spreading through the wall of tradition. Watching humans work had done something to the frozen aliens. It had reminded them of something, or perhaps taught them something new. Daniel Cole moved through the station like a ghost, appearing wherever he was needed most. His shoulder had stopped hurting hours ago, which probably meant something was seriously wrong with it. He did not have time to care. He found himself in a corridor where a Tyrellian child lay dying. The young warrior could not have been more than 10 years old in human terms. Shrapnel had torn through his chest, and purple blood pooled beneath him. His commander stood frozen above him, tears streaming down an immobile face. Daniel knelt beside the child and took his hand. The young Tyrellian's eyes focused on him with difficulty. Daniel spoke softly, telling the child that he was not alone. He stayed there, holding that small clawed hand until the light faded from those young eyes. He stood slowly. The Tyrellian commander was still frozen, but his grief had intensified. His massive body trembled with the effort of staying still. Everything in him wanted to move, to rage, to mourn properly. But tradition held him in place. Daniel looked at the commander and spoke simply. He said that there was no shame in movement. He said that love did not require stillness. He said that the child had not died alone because a human refused to stop. The commander said nothing. But something in his eyes changed. Daniel moved on. There were others who needed him. The station sensors detected an incoming vessel. Captain Kevin reported that it was Tyrellian, a military ship from the extremist faction that had planted the bomb. They were approaching with weapons armed. The frozen aliens should have responded to this threat. Defense systems should have activated. Security protocols should have engaged. Instead, the stillness held, and the galaxy's oldest space station drifted defenseless. Daniel reached the central hub, where the main defense controls were located. Tyrellian officers stood frozen at their posts, watching screens that showed the approaching enemy. They could see death coming, and they would not move to stop it. He studied the unfamiliar controls, trying to understand systems designed for alien hands. He did not know how to activate the station's defenses. He did not speak Tyrellian well enough to read the labels. But he had to try. Kath Nora's voice came through his communicator. She talked him through the controls, describing each step in clear, simple terms. She was still in the medical wing, still saving lives, but she found time to help him as well. With her guidance, Daniel activated the station's defensive shields. The incoming vessel's weapons would not destroy Accord Prime. Not yet. But shields alone would not stop a boarding party. If the extremists reached the station, they would finish what the bomb had started. They would kill everyone, human and alien alike. Daniel looked at the frozen Tyrellian officers around him. He needed them. He needed them to move, to fight, to remember that they were warriors before they were mourners. He did not have words for what he needed to say. So he simply stood there, one human in a room full of giants, and refused to be still. The enemy ship drew closer. The station's shields held. And somewhere in the frozen hearts of a dozen alien species, something began to stir. 6 hours had passed since the explosion. Accord Prime was dying slowly. Emergency power kept the lights on, but life support systems were failing across the station. Somewhere in the lower sections, a hull breach was venting atmosphere into space. Repair crews from 12 different species stood frozen at their posts, observing the stillness while their station crumbled around them. Daniel Cole had not rested. His shoulder throbbed with every movement, but he ignored it. The young Veth delegate he had saved was stable now, resting in what remained of the medical wing. 36 humans had answered his call for volunteers. They were spread across the station now, doing what they could. The corridors of Accord Prime felt like a tomb. Daniel moved through them quickly, stepping around frozen aliens who stood like monuments to grief. A Tyrellian warrior blocked a doorway, and Daniel had to squeeze past him. The massive reptilian did not react. His eyes were open, but he saw nothing. Daniel understood grief. He had lost people before, but this was something beyond his experience. The aliens had not merely paused to mourn. They had disconnected from reality entirely. They had abandoned the living to honor the dead. His communicator crackled. Lisa Park's voice came through, strained but steady. She was the chief medical officer on the human vessel Steadfast, and she had been one of the first volunteers to beam aboard the station. She was trapped in the medical wing with wounded aliens and failing equipment. Daniel told her he was coming. He broke into a run. The medical wing was on the far side of the station, past the main hub and through two sections that had sustained heavy damage. Daniel climbed over debris and squeezed through gaps that should have been too small for him. His uniform tore. His hands bled. He kept moving. He found Lisa in a room filled with wounded from 6 different species. The lights flickered overhead. Medical equipment beeped warnings that no one was addressing. Lisa stood over an operating table where a Garth delegate lay with his stone-like chest split open by shrapnel. She looked exhausted. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and other things. Her hands were covered in blood of several different colors. But her eyes were sharp, and her voice was calm when she spoke to Daniel. She explained the situation. 47 wounded in this section alone. Life support failing. No help from alien medical staff because they were all frozen. She had 3 human nurses and not enough supplies. People were going to die. Daniel asked what she needed most. She said time. She needed time that they did not have. He looked around the room. Tyrellian medical equipment stood unused because no Tyrellian would move to operate it. Veth healing chambers sat empty because no Veth would activate them. Everything they needed was right here, locked away by cultural protocols that made no sense to human minds. A young Tyrellian officer stood frozen near the entrance. She was smaller than the warriors Daniel had seen, probably a medical or technical specialist. Her scales were a lighter shade, almost orange, and her eyes tracked Daniel's movement, even though her body remained still. He had noticed this before. Some aliens were starting to watch the humans, even if they could not bring themselves to act. Daniel approached her slowly. He spoke in a calm voice, explaining that he needed help operating the medical equipment. He told her that he understood her grief, that he respected her customs, but the people were dying. Her people. His people. All of them. The Tyrellian's eyes met his. Something passed between them. Pain, perhaps. Shame. The desire to move, warring with the command to be still. Then she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from hours of silence. She said her name was Kethnora. She said that what her people had done was unforgivable. The extremists who planted the bomb were Tyrellian. They had murdered 17 delegates and broken sacred laws of hospitality. And now her people stood frozen while the wounded died around them. Daniel told her that none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the Gorath on the operating table. What mattered was the Veth child bleeding in the corner. What mattered was action. Kethnora closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had changed. She stepped forward, breaking her stillness for the second time since the explosion. Daniel heard a soft gasp from somewhere behind him. Other Tyrellians were watching. Other species were watching. This young officer had just violated one of the oldest traditions in galactic culture. She moved to the medical console and began activating equipment. Her claws flew across holographic controls. The healing chambers hummed to life. Diagnostic screens lit up with information that Lisa's human equipment could not provide. Lisa did not waste time on thanks. She started directing Kethnora, pointing to patients, describing wounds, asking questions about alien physiology. The 2 women worked together as if they had trained for years. Language barriers fell away in the face of shared purpose. Daniel stepped back and let them work. He had other things to do. He moved through the station, checking on other human volunteers. Maria Santos, a young engineer from the Steadfast, was working on life support in the lower sections. She had managed to seal the hull breach with emergency patches, but the main systems needed extensive repairs. Kevin Grant, the Steadfast captain, was coordinating from orbit, tracking the location of every human on the station. Kevin's voice came through the communicator, tense and worried. Other species were sending angry messages. The Sindari accused humanity of disrespecting the dead. The Gorath called them cultural barbarians. The Turellian High Command had transmitted a formal protest. Daniel asked if any of them were offering to help with the wounded. Kevin laughed bitterly. No, they were too busy being offended. Daniel told him to ignore the protests. Let them file complaints. Let them be angry. Humanity would deal with the diplomatic fallout later. Right now, people were dying, and stopping was not an option. He continued through the station, past frozen aliens who watched him with eyes that held confusion and something else. Something that might have been gratitude. He found a corridor where bodies lay uncollected. Human volunteers were carefully moving the dead to a temporary morgue, treating them with dignity, even though no alien would help. Daniel stopped to help carry a Veth delegate, whose compound eyes still reflected the emergency lights. This was how humans mourned. They did not stop. They honored the dead by caring for them, by ensuring they were treated with respect. And then they turned back to the living. Back in the medical wing, Lisa had saved 3 more patients. Kethnora had called up ancient Turellian healing techniques that human databases knew nothing about. Together, they were achieving the impossible. But it was not enough. There were too many wounded and too few hands willing to move. Daniel knew that unless something changed, dozens would die in the coming hours. He stood in the center of the medical wing and looked at the frozen aliens who lined the walls. They were watching now. All of them. Their bodies were still, but their eyes followed every human movement. They saw Lisa fighting to save a child. They saw Kethnora defying her culture to help strangers. They saw Daniel, bleeding and exhausted, refusing to stop. He wondered if they understood. He wondered if they would ever understand. Humanity did not stop after tragedy. Tragedy was when they moved fast as thought. The station groaned around them. More systems were failing. Time was running out. Daniel activated his communicator and sent a message to every human on the station. He told them to keep going. He told them that every life they saved mattered. He told them that the galaxy was watching, and humanity would show them what it meant to be human. Then he picked up a medical kit and went back to work. There was no time to rest. There never was. The space station called Accord Prime floated in the darkness between 3 star systems. It belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. For 200 years, species from across the galaxy had come here to talk instead of fight. Today, 12 different civilizations had sent their best diplomats to discuss peace. Daniel Cole stood near the back of the Great Hall and watched the proceedings with careful eyes. He was 34 years old, a diplomatic attaché serving under Ambassador Yurasan. His job was to observe, take notes, and stay out of the way. He was good at his job. The hall was enormous, built to accommodate species of all sizes. Turellian warriors stood 7 feet tall with scales the color of dried blood. They spoke in rumbling voices that made the floor vibrate. The Veth collective delegates were smaller, insectoid beings who communicated through clicks and chemical signals the human translators could barely process. There were others too. The pale and willowy Sindari, the stone-skinned Gorth, the luminescent Felxi who floated rather than walked. All of them had come because the Turellians and Veth were on the edge of war. A disputed mining sector had sparked 3 border skirmishes in the past month. If full war broke out, half the galaxy would be forced to choose sides. Ambassador San stood at the central podium and spoke with the calm authority that had made her famous. She was proposing a compromise that would give mining rights to the Veth while allowing Turellian security vessels to patrol the sector. It was elegant. It was fair. Both sides seemed ready to accept it. Daniel noticed something strange. The Turellian guards near the eastern entrance were moving differently. Their posture had changed. They kept glancing at each other in a way that felt wrong. He started to move toward Ambassador San, but stopped himself. He was being paranoid. Tyrellian body language was notoriously difficult to read. He was probably imagining things. High Speaker Uranus of the Veth Collective rose to respond to the proposal. The ancient insectoid's translator crackled as it converted clicks into words. The High Speaker expressed cautious approval. The room seemed to relax. After weeks of tension, peace finally felt possible. Daniel allowed himself to smile. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. The last moment before everything changed. The explosion came from somewhere near the eastern entrance. The sound was unlike anything Daniel had ever heard. It was not just loud. It was a physical force that threw him backward and stole the air from his lungs. He hit the floor hard and felt something crack in his shoulder. For several seconds, he could not see or hear anything. The world was white noise and pain. Then his vision began to clear, and he wished it had not. The eastern side of the great hall was gone. Where delegates had stood moments ago, there was now twisted metal and fire. Bodies lay everywhere. Some were still. Others were not. Daniel saw a Tyrellian warrior missing half his body, still trying to crawl forward. He saw a Sendari diplomat staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. He saw blood in colors he did not recognize. He forced himself to stand. His shoulder screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He had to find Ambassador San. He had to help someone. He had to do something. He found the ambassador lying behind the podium. She was alive but unconscious, with a deep gash across her forehead. Daniel checked her breathing and found it steady. He looked around for help. That was when he noticed the silence. The explosion's echoes had faded, and in their place was something far more disturbing. Every alien in the hall had stopped moving. Not just the wounded. Everyone. The Tyrellian warriors who had survived stood frozen like statues. The Veth delegates had locked their limbs in rigid positions. The Sindari, the Goroth, the Felxi, all of them had simply stopped. Daniel called out for help. His voice echoed in the ruined hall. No one responded. No one even looked at him. He approached a Tyrellian guard, who seemed uninjured. The massive warrior stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on some distant point. Daniel spoke to him, touched his arm, even shouted in his face. Nothing. The Tyrellian did not acknowledge him at all. A horrible understanding began to form in Daniel's mind. He had read about this in cultural briefings. When tragedy struck on this scale, most galactic species observed what they called the stillness. It was a mourning ritual, a sacred pause that honored the dead by ceasing all action. Different species practiced it in different ways, but the core principle was the same. When death came, you stopped. You did not move, speak, or act until the mourning period ended. For humans, this concept was entirely foreign. When disaster struck, humans ran toward it. They searched for survivors. They treated the wounded. They rebuilt what was broken. Stopping was not in their nature. Daniel looked around the devastated hall. 17 delegates were dead. High Speaker Uranus was among them, which meant the Veth Collective had lost their leader. Dozens more were wounded, and they were receiving no treatment because every medical professional from every species had entered the stillness. He saw a young Veth delegate clutching a wound in her thorax. Purple blood seeped between her limbs. She would die without treatment. Her own people stood frozen around her, their compound eyes wet with what might have been tears, but their bodies refused to move. Daniel ran to her side and pressed his hands against the wound. The Veth made a sound of surprise. Perhaps she had expected him to be frozen too. He told her to hold on, that help was coming, even though he was not sure that was true. He looked around for medical supplies, for other humans, for anyone who would move. The station's communication system crackled with emergency messages. Human ships in orbit were demanding information. Other species were broadcasting mourning declarations and calling their people to stillness. The contrast was stark. Humans asked what they could do. Everyone else announced that they would do nothing. Daniel kept pressure on the Veth's wound and watched the frozen figures around him. Their grief was real. Their pain was genuine. But their response was something he could not understand. People were dying right now, and they had chosen to stop. He thought about what his father had told him years ago. The old man had been a firefighter who ran into burning buildings for 30 years. He had said that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was being afraid and moving forward anyway. The dead deserved tears, but the living deserved action. Daniel made a decision. Humanity would not observe the stillness. They could not. It went against everything they were. He activated his communicator with his free hand and sent a message to the human ships in orbit. He described the situation, the wounded, the frozen aliens, the desperate need for help. He asked for volunteers. He knew that breaking galactic mourning protocol could have serious diplomatic consequences. He did not care that the Veth delegate's bleeding was slowing. Daniel kept talking to her, kept telling her that she would be fine. Around him, the aliens remained frozen, watching from behind motionless eyes. He was the only thing moving in a hall full of statues. He did not know if help would come. He did not know if his actions would spark an incident or save lives or both. He only knew that he could not stop. Humans did not stop. It was not who they were. The smoke rose toward the damaged ceiling. The fires crackled. The wounded made small sounds of pain. And Daniel Cole kept moving, the only living thing in motion, while the galaxy held its breath and waited.